how I noticed something odd about the Bible. I never thought I would spend so much time reading about ancient history, but here I am. The whole thing started because of something small. I was flipping through the Bible one evening, not for any deep reason, just curiosity, and I noticed something that felt oddly out of place. I kept spotting dogs, sheep, goats, oxen, donkeys, camels, and even lions scattered through the pages. But not once did I come across anything that looked like a house cat. I even checked again because I figured maybe I missed it somewhere, maybe in a footnote or an obscure passage. But no, there was not a single cat anywhere in the whole book. And that sat with me. I'm not a scholar or anything fancy, just a regular American guy who likes to understand things. I have two cats at home. They follow me around like I am their personal chef. So it felt strange that the Bible, with all the everyday animals people depended on, never mentions what today is one of the most common pets on Earth. At first I thought, maybe this is just a weird coincidence. But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Why would the writers leave out such a familiar animal? They mention dogs plenty of times. They mention sheep hundreds of times. They reference oxen, camels, and donkeys again and again. Dogs in particular show up more often than people expect, sometimes helping, sometimes scavenging around towns. But cats? Nothing. Not a whisper. That little question turned into something much bigger. I started digging into research, and once I began, I just kept going deeper. And to my surprise, brand new studies published in the year 2025 gave me the clearest explanation I had ever heard. These were detailed genetic studies on ancient cats, tracking how they spread across different regions. What I found changed how I looked at both cats and ancient history. How new genetic studies changed the story. It turns out the whole idea that cats were domesticated early in the Fertile Crescent, the same region where farming began, is only half true. Scientists used to think cats naturally came into human settlements when people started storing grain, because rodents would show up and cats would follow. But the new genetic research showed something much more specific. The house cats we know today, the ones that curl up on our couches and expect us to serve the meals on time, come from a very particular place, North Africa. And even within North Africa, the main evidence points straight toward ancient Egypt and the land surrounding it. Now, Egypt is famous for its love of cats. Most people have seen those images of elegant, stylized cats sitting beside Egyptian gods or being painted on tomb walls. It has been a popular belief for ages that the Egyptians domesticated cats early and turned them into sacred animals. And while there is truth in that idea, the research suggests the story is a lot more complicated. The scientists found that many of the oldest cat burials and early cat artwork in Egypt did not necessarily show fully domesticated cats. Instead, they may have been showing African wildcats, a species that looks very similar to modern cats, but behaves very differently. These wildcats likely hung around humans, but they were not fully domesticated or selectively bred the way dogs or livestock were. According to the new evidence, the true spread of the domestic cats we know today did not happen until much later, around 2,000 years ago. That means the real explosion of household cats came long after many books of the Bible were already written. Even more interesting, the research showed that Roman trade routes, especially grain ships, played a huge role in pushing cats across the Mediterranean world. The Romans used cats on ships to deal with rats that would eat the stored grain. As Roman ships traveled, so did cats, hopping from port to port, settling in new lands. But that massive spread did not start until roughly the 1st century before the Common Era, maybe even into the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. And by that time, the bulk of the Hebrew Bible, the part most people call the Old Testament, was already complete. Why the writers of the Hebrew Bible had no reason to mention cats. This part honestly fascinated me. When I realized that fully domesticated cats simply had not reached the regions where the biblical authors lived, everything suddenly made sense. During most of the period when the Hebrew Bible was being written, cats were either not present at all or so rare that they were basically irrelevant. The people living in Israel, Judah, Canaan, and nearby lands just did not have cats as part of their homes, farms, or daily life. I kept picturing what life looked like back then. These communities depended heavily on animals that could support their work. Dogs helped with herding and served as guard animals and scavengers. Sheep and goats produced food, milk, and wool. Oxen plowed the land. Camels and donkeys transported goods. Cattle played major roles in farming and sacrifice. Every one of those animals had a job. They were part of the economic system, part of rituals, and part of everyday chores. Cats, on the other hand, simply did not exist in that setting. They were not herders. They were not pack animals. They were not used for sacrifice. They did not help plow fields. And they were not common enough to show up as symbols, metaphors, or characters in stories. The biblical authors wrote about what they saw around them. They were not trying to create a complete encyclopedia of animals. They were describing the world they knew. And in that world, cats were pretty much non-existent. Once that clicked for me, the silence made perfect sense. It was not a mistake or some grand mystery. It was just a reflection of reality. When I looked outside the Bible, the pattern was the same. What surprised me even more was that the Bible was not the only ancient text that left cats out. When I checked other writings from the same general time and region, Mesopotamia, Syria, and nearby areas, I found the same thing happening again and again. I looked at the instructions of Shuruppak, the Code of Hammurabi, various Mesopotamian omen lists, the Epic of Gilgamesh, writings from Ugarit in ancient Syria, and even the Dead Sea Scrolls. These texts mention all kinds of animals. They talk about lions. They talk about dogs. They talk about oxen, pigs, donkeys, sheep, goats, horses, and all sorts of creatures. But when I look for cats, nothing. Silence. This was when I realized something important. Not only were cats missing from the Bible, they were missing from the entire broader cultural landscape of the ancient Near East. Cats simply were not part of daily life in these regions at the time. It was not that people disliked cats. They just did not have them. Egypt was the one exception, but even there, the story was messy. Now, of course, Egypt had a long love affair with cats. Everyone knows that. Egyptians drew cats, buried them, even mummified them. They used cats in art and religion. Cats appear in their mythology and symbolism. But even here, the new research added an extra twist. A lot of the early Egyptian depictions we always assumed were domesticated cats might actually have been wild cats sitting near people, tolerated but not fully owned. They were not necessarily the same gentle breeds we keep as pets today. And the genetic evidence suggests that it took a long time, much longer than many people believed, for actual domestic cat lineages to develop in Egypt and then spread out to other parts of the world. So even in the one place where cats were culturally important, the full domestication process was not as straightforward or early as everyone used to think. What this means for biblical history. All of this led me to a simple conclusion that I had never expected when I first noticed the strange absence of cats in the Bible. The biblical writers did not mention cats because cats were not there. It is that simple. It is not a missing detail. It is not a theological puzzle. It is not something overlooked by accident. The world of the Bible was filled with animals people needed for survival, and cats had not yet become one of those animals. When cats finally started spreading widely through the Mediterranean world, the main period of biblical writing was already in the rearview mirror. By the time the New Testament was being written, cats were beginning to travel more widely, mostly because of Roman trade routes. But even then, they had not yet become the household pets we know today, and they had not become common in the areas where early Christians lived. So the silence in Scripture mirrors the silence in everyday life. Why this discovery felt bigger than just cats. The more I learned, the more I realized this was not just about cats. This was a reminder of how much history can change based on new scientific discoveries. Genetic research opened doors that old archaeology alone could not. It also reminded me that ancient texts are snapshots of the world people lived in. They show us not just beliefs and laws, but what life actually looked like, what people saw, what they touched, what they depended on. And cats were simply not part of that world. What happened when I dug deeper into ancient records? After finishing my first round of reading and realizing how completely cats were missing from the Bible and other ancient writings, I got curious in a way I had not expected. I felt almost pulled into the subject, like there was a thread I needed to follow all the way to the end. I guess that is what happens when one small question grabs hold of your brain. I found myself spending late nights reading through studies, articles, translations of ancient texts, and even archaeology papers. Sometimes I wondered how my life had gone from working with my hands and relaxing with a couple of cats on my couch to me, sitting at midnight comparing Babylonian cuneiform logs with Egyptian tomb paintings. It still makes me laugh. The more I looked, the more consistent the pattern became. Everyone in the ancient Near East wrote about animals constantly, but almost never cats. In fact, as I compared different eras and places, I realized something even more surprising. Not only were cats missing, but the people living in those regions did not even have a cultural category for them. In other words, cats were not ignored. They were simply not there to even be ignored. That realization hit me harder than I expected. Not because it was emotional, but because it let me see how tightly ancient writing was connected to daily life. People wrote what mattered to them, what shaped their work, their fears, their stories, their laws. Cats had no role in that world, so writers had no reason to mention them. I kept thinking about how different that is from today, where you cannot walk across a neighborhood without spotting a cat staring at you through a window or trotting across a driveway. Our whole sense of what a normal animal is would have been completely foreign to people in the biblical world. The strange silence of Mesopotamia. I turned my attention to Mesopotamia first, the ancient region of Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia, and Assyria. Their texts are some of the oldest we have in human history, and they wrote down everything from business deals to prayers to epic poems. Mesopotamian writers described animals in incredibly vivid detail. They talked about lions roaring on the edge of the desert, herds of sheep grazing across fields, massive oxen pulling plows, donkeys carrying trade goods, dogs following shepherds, pigs rooting in city streets, horses used in chariots, and yet no cats. It was almost unsettling to see a whole world laid out in words, full of noise and movement, and realize the one thing missing was the animal that sleeps next to my feet every evening. I dug into one of the earliest pieces of wisdom literature, something called the Instructions of Shurupak. It is basically a father giving his son advice about how to live well. The father warns him about dangerous animals, tells him how to treat his workers, how to navigate storms, and how to store food. He mentions dogs and goats and oxen, but again, not a single reference to cats. I checked the Code of Hammurabi, a huge set of laws that covers livestock, marriage, property, and debt. The law code includes details on oxen goring someone, donkeys damaging property, or sheep being stolen. But there was no law or even a side comment about cats. If cats had been used for controlling pests, or if people owned them as companions, you would expect at least something. But there was nothing. Then I read parts of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where wild animals represent power and freedom. The writers mention lions, bulls, and dogs. But again, not a single cat. By this point, I was no longer surprised, but I was still fascinated. The silence was so absolute that I started thinking of it as an archaeological clue. The Ugaritic mystery. After Mesopotamia, I turned to ancient Ugarit, a coastal kingdom in what is now Syria. Their texts are incredibly important because their language was very close to early Hebrew, and their culture shared many similarities with the world of the Bible. If cats had been even somewhat familiar to the people of Israel, Judea, or Canaan, I expected something to appear here. But Ugarit was the same. They described dogs as protectors, horses as valuable animals for war, cattle as wealth, goats and sheep as everyday staples. They wrote myths, poems, battle accounts, and divination records. But I went through page after page, and nothing in those clay tablets mentioned cats. The consistency across different cultures convinced me that this was not an accident. It was a genuine absence, a piece of evidence that ancient life did not include cats the way we understand them today. The Dead Sea Scrolls gave me the final confirmation. I wondered if things changed later in history, closer to the time of the New Testament. So I turned to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were written by Jewish communities between the 3rd century before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era. That is a time when cats were finally beginning to spread around the Mediterranean world, but still slowly. I read through fragments of commentaries, prayers, community rules, and scriptural interpretations. I found references to sheep, goats, dogs, cattle, and wild animals. But again, no cats. That sealed it for me. If even the Dead Sea Scrolls writers, living much later than the authors of the Hebrew Bible, did not talk about cats, then cats simply were not a meaningful part of life in Israel or Judea at that time. So why did Egypt love cats so much? With all that silence from the rest of the ancient Near East, I turned my attention to Egypt, the one place where cats really were a big deal. Everybody knows Egypt had a deep connection with cats. They buried them in their own tombs, painted them on walls, carved statues of them, and associated them with divine protection. But once I started digging into the new research, what I found surprised me. The cats that Egypt loved early on were probably not domesticated cats the way we understand them today. Instead, they were African wildcats, animals that lived near villages and hung around humans, but were not truly tamed. Egyptians respected them because they kept mice and snakes away. Over time, they became symbols of grace, protection, and motherhood. But here's the part that shocked me. The earliest cat mummies may not have been fully domesticated cats either. It is possible that Egyptians mummified semi-wild cats simply because they represented sacred qualities, not because they were household pets in a modern sense. This changed how I looked at Egyptian cat culture. It was not a simple story of Egyptians inventing the domestic cat early. It was a slow, uneven process, one that took centuries, even millennia, before it produced the modern house cat. And this helps explain why Egypt's love for cats did not spread quickly into Israel, Judah, or other nearby areas. The Egyptians may have venerated cats, but that does not mean those cats were traveling across borders in meaningful numbers. The real explosion of cats came with Rome. Once I reached this part of my reading, I noticed a pattern that kept showing up again and again in the research. Domestic cats truly began spreading widely during the Roman period. And the reason was not religious or cultural. It was practical. The Romans were obsessed with storing grain. Grain was everything to them. It fed their armies. It supplied their cities. It supported their colonies. It kept the empire stable. Rats love grain. Rats ate grain. Rats ruined grain. So the Romans needed a solution that moved with their ships and caravans. Cats were the perfect answer. They were small, quiet, effective, and could reproduce quickly. Once the Romans realized this, they started bringing cats on their ships as natural pest control. And just like that, cats began spreading throughout the Mediterranean world, hopping from port to port with every shipment of grain. But this happened after the main books of the Hebrew Bible were already finished. By the time cats were traveling in large numbers, kings of Israel and Judah were long gone. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel had lived centuries earlier. Historical books like Kings and Chronicles were complete. Laws and traditions had already been set in place. The world had changed, but the biblical texts were already written. This meant the spread of domestic cats simply came too late to be reflected in the scriptures. When I connected all the pieces, it finally made sense. By now, my notes were a mess. I had pages full of timelines, maps, and scribbles comparing Egyptian cat burials with Roman grain routes. It was the most research I had done since high school, and it was strangely fun. But once I laid it all out, the story became clear. Early Egypt had wild cats, not fully domesticated cats. The Levant, Israel, Judah, Canaan, Syria, had almost no cats at all. Mesopotamia was silent on cats for thousands of years. Domestic cats, did not spread widely until Roman times. By then, the Hebrew Bible was already complete. When the pieces finally came together, I felt the same kind of satisfaction I get when I finish a long project or fix something complicated around the house. It is that moment where everything snaps into place. And for the first time, the absence of cats in the Bible stopped feeling like a strange omission. It started feeling completely logical, an honest reflection of the world as it actually was. The cultural life of dogs versus cats. One of the most interesting things I realized during this research was how differently ancient people viewed dogs and cats. Dogs have been domesticated for thousands of years, long before any written texts existed. Humans shaped dogs into herders, hunters, guards, and helpers. Dogs were everywhere, doing all sorts of tasks. So of course they show up in stories, laws, metaphors, and prayers. Cats, meanwhile, had none of those jobs in the ancient Near East. Cats were not herders, not hunters used by people, not pack animals, not sacrificial animals, not plow animals, not used for transport, not widely owned, not culturally meaningful outside Egypt. In short, the Israelites had no practical or symbolic reason to mention cats. Once I saw this difference clearly, I understood why dogs appear quite a bit in the Bible. Sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in negative ways, but cats do not appear at all. How this changed the way I think about ancient texts. When I first noticed that cats were missing from the Bible, it felt like a small curiosity. But the more I learned, the more I realized it pointed to something much deeper. Ancient writing reflects the world people lived in, not the world we live in now. People wrote about the animals they raised, the animals that threatened them, the animals that fed them, the animals that worked for them, the animals that symbolized their beliefs. The writers were not trying to create a full scientific list of animals. They were describing their own daily experiences. And their daily experiences simply did not include cats. That silence is not a mistake. It is a historical snapshot. It captures a world before the modern house cat existed, or at least before it played any meaningful role in human life outside Egypt. How I began explaining this to others. Once I had sorted it all out of my mind, I tried explaining it to a couple of friends just to see if it made sense out loud. And they reacted the same way I did in the beginning. Wait, the Bible does not mention cats. Seriously? And then, after I walked them through the research, oh, that actually makes perfect sense. One friend laughed and said, honestly, that might be the least mysterious mystery I have heard in a long time. And he was right. The truth is simple. Cats were not part of the world the Bible came from. It is a reminder that history is full of moments where what we think is obvious now was not obvious then. It is easy to assume the past looked like our world, just with older clothing or different tools. But the past had its own rhythm, its own animals, its own patterns. What this discovery taught me about how knowledge changes over time. By the time I reached the end of all this research, I realized something unexpected. The original question, why does the Bible not mention cats, had quietly grown into a much bigger story. It had become a reminder of how slow and tangled the path to understanding really is. Most of us grow up thinking history is simple, that ancient people lived in a world we can imagine in our heads. But the more I learned, the more I realized their world was not just different. It was practically another universe. And that difference becomes clear when you start noticing what is missing, not just what is there. I kept thinking about how comfortable we are around cats today. You see them in windows, on fences, curled up on couches, wandering through backyards like they own the place. They are part of daily life in a way that feels almost automatic. You can walk into almost any home in America and find either a cat or someone who owned a cat at some point. But in the ancient Near East, that was not the case at all. A person living in Israel or Babylon or Syria would have gone their entire life without ever seeing a domestic cat. Even if a few cats lived nearby, they were probably rare wanderers, half-wild animals no one really interacted with. And that is the world the biblical writers lived in. They wrote what they knew. They wrote what they saw. They wrote what mattered to them. It reminded me of something one of my old teachers once said. You cannot understand a text unless you understand the world around it. Until this research, I never truly understood what that meant. Looking at animals through ancient eyes, when I zoomed out and thought about all the animals mentioned in the Bible, they suddenly made perfect sense. The Bible talks about sheep more than any other animal because sheep were everywhere. They were sources of wool, milk, and meat. They were living wealth. They shaped the rhythm of daily life. Goats, cattle, and donkeys were the same. They worked the land, carried loads, and sustained communities. Even lions made sense. They represented danger, power, and the wild edges of civilization. People feared lions. They told stories about lions. So lions earned a place in their writings. But cats? They were not common enough to be feared. They were not helpful enough to be valued. They were not present enough to be recognized. They were not connected to any religious or symbolic tradition outside Egypt. Once you understand that, the silence does not feel like something missing. It feels completely natural. The passage of time and the slow spread of cats. When I finished reading about the timeline of cat domestication, the story almost felt like a slow-moving wave stretching across centuries. If I were to map it in simple terms, it would go something like this. First wave. African wildcats begin living near humans in North Africa. They linger around villages, hunting rodents, but not living as pets. This is the earliest stage, long before any famous Egyptian art. Second wave. Egyptians start valuing these cats, not necessarily as pets, but as animals with a special symbolic role. They appear in tombs, paintings, and religious stories. But the cats themselves are still partly wild, still not fully domesticated. Third wave. Over many centuries, cats in Egypt slowly become more comfortable around people. A true domestic line eventually forms, but only around the early centuries of the Common Era. Fourth wave. Roman ships become the main engine spreading cats from Egypt and North Africa to Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Cats travel the world one grain ship at a time, jumping off at ports, breeding, spreading, taking hold. By the time cats start becoming widespread, the world of the Bible has already passed. The temples of Jerusalem have been built and destroyed. The prophets' voices have faded into history. The New Testament has begun spreading, but even then, daily life in Israel and Judea is still not filled with cats. To put it simply, cats entered the human home too late to enter biblical history. A missing animal that tells a very real story. What surprised me the most was how the absence of cats taught me more than their presence ever could. Sometimes what is not mentioned says as much as what is written down. If you think about it, ancient writers lived in a world that was overwhelmingly shaped by necessity. Every animal that appears in their texts had a purpose, practical, symbolic, or religious. The animals they left out were the ones that had no role in their lives. And that is the story of the cat. It did not herd. It did not pull carts. It did not protect flocks. It did not appear in rituals. It did not represent a shared cultural symbol. So the biblical world moved forward without it. And that small gap in ancient writing became a clue, pointing backward through time, telling us something scientific research is now confirming, that the household cat is a surprisingly recent companion. How this changed my view of the ancient Near East. After weeks of reading, studying, and piecing all this together, something else changed for me. I realized the ancient Near East was more complex than I had ever imagined. It was not just a place with dusty scrolls and old ruins. It was a living, breathing world filled with people who knew the animals around them as deeply as we know our everyday routines. Farmers would have known every sheep by sight. Shepherds knew every dog that guarded their flock. People could tell you how to train a donkey, how to milk a goat, how to lead an ox, how to hunt a lion, and how to trade a camel. But ask one of them about a cat, and they would probably shrug. It would not mean anything to them. That alone tells you how different their lives were from ours. It also made me appreciate how careful we have to be when we read ancient texts. It is easy to assume our experiences match theirs. It is easy to imagine biblical characters surrounded by the same animals we see around us today. But if you stepped into their world, you would not find the familiar house cat waiting to curl up in your lap. Their world was shaped by animals with purposes, animals that worked, animals that fed them, animals that represented something in their spiritual life. In that sense, the silence of the Bible about cats is not an oversight. It is evidence. The unexpected role of science in answering an ancient question. What made this all even more fascinating was that it took modern science, especially genetics, to truly answer a question about ancient literature. For most of my life, I thought of archaeology as digging up pottery or old bones. I never imagined that genetic markers in ancient cat remains could rewrite what we know about human history. But that is exactly what happened. The 2025 genetic study that traced the lineage of modern house cats opened a door no one expected. It showed which cats were fully domesticated, where they came from, how they moved, when they spread into new regions, which ancient cultures had them and which did not. It revealed a picture that matched perfectly with the silence of ancient texts. To me, there was something beautiful about that, the idea that science and history, separated by thousands of years, can meet in the middle and explain one another. It reminded me that every detail in the world has a story behind it, even something as small as a missing animal in a very old book. Seeing Egypt with fresh eyes. One of the most surprising shifts in my thinking was how I now looked at ancient Egypt. Before diving into all this, I had the same picture in my head that most people do, rows of sleek, graceful cats lounging beside priests, helping families and walking like divine creatures through temples. That image is not wrong, but it is incomplete. After reading the scientific studies, I realized Egyptian cat culture was rooted in something deeper and wilder. Many cats Egyptians honored were not pets the way we think of pets. They were wild animals that lived close to people, cooperating with them in an unspoken way. Egyptians admired them because they controlled pests and represented protection. They respected them because they kept snakes away and reminded people of the protective goddess Bodhet. But it was not until much later, perhaps around the Roman period, that the truly domesticated cat began to appear. So even in the land where cats were loved the most, the process was gradual and uneven. The idea of a fluffy house cat lounging on a pillow is a much more recent development. That realization helped me understand why Egypt's love for cats did not simply spread into Israel or Judah. People admired Egyptian culture in many ways, but animals tied to one region's symbolic world seldom jumped into another's uninvited. The ancient Near East was not a single culture. It was a patchwork of traditions. Even animals were tied to those traditions. When everything finally came together, by the end of this long journey through ancient texts and modern science, I sat back one evening and tried to put everything into one simple explanation, something I could tell someone in a single sentence. And here's what I came up with. The Bible does not mention cats because the people who wrote it did not have them. That is the whole truth wrapped up neatly. But behind that one sentence is a mountain of history. The slow domestication of African wildcats, the deep cultural traditions of ancient Egypt, the silence of Mesopotamian law codes, the absence in Ugaritic myth, the lack of cats in Dead Sea Scrolls, the steady rise of cats under Roman expansion, the fact that biblical books were written before cats became common. All those pieces fit together to answer what looks like a simple question, but actually touches thousands of years of human history. It taught me that ancient literature is not made of words alone. It is made of the world those writers lived in. When you understand their world, the texts become clearer, richer, and more real. And something as small as a missing cat can reopen an entire chapter of human history. Why this journey was worth it? I never planned to take such a deep dive into the history of cats or biblical culture. I never imagined I would spend so much time reading old tablets and scientific papers. But looking back, I'm glad I did. Because the journey taught me that the world is full of stories hiding in plain sight. Stories that reveal themselves only when you follow your curiosity. A missing animal became a doorway into the spread of ancient trade, the origins of domesticated species, the everyday life of farmers and shepherds, the beliefs of entire civilizations, the impact of scientific research, the deep structures of ancient writing. And in the end, I felt like I understood not just why cats were not mentioned in the Bible, but why they eventually became part of our lives. It made me appreciate the cats in my own home a little more, not just because they keep the occasional mouse away, but because they carry with them a history that stretches back thousands of years. They're not just pets. They are descendants of a long journey, from African wildcats wandering through Egyptian fields to Roman ships sailing across the Mediterranean to the family homes we live in today. Their story is older and more mysterious than I ever imagined, and I never would have learned any of it if a simple question had not tugged at my mind one quiet evening.